to 8 in the morning on the 24th of August 2017, and welcome to the second to last podcast in the Partsufum theory, which is on the subject of the Yakida, or the higher genius. And this morning, taking the video down on the stop bank of the Narororo River while I'm going for my morning walk, and the rest of the video will probably be back at my place in a few hours, because it's a beautiful clear day, and even though it's freezing at the moment, it's going to be relatively warm and sunny there and no wind. Here we are, podcast number 17, Yakida. And there is one all-encompassing primary concept that everybody who is familiar with the Hermetic education and Hermetic initiatory process is interested in, and that is the subject of knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel. That's a common term for it, or what I prefer to call knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. So this podcast is largely going to focus on the nature of that aspect of Hermetic training, knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. But first of all, I just want to cover a couple of basic concepts. So let's start by taking a quick look at the Latinized spelling of the term Yakida. And the term Yakida can be translated into English as meaning unity consciousness. And when everything that we are considering about the nature of Yakida refers back to this very simple but profound concept of unity consciousness. So I'm going to be talking a lot about that now. All of the other Partsufum, the other 5 primary Partsufum, all come together, are harmonized and unified in that condition that we refer to as Yakida. So Yakida represents the sum total of all of the primary Sephiroth, all of their functions, all of their structure, and everything that they stand for and cover. In alchemical lore, the Yakida is often referred to by using the term quintessence, and this is an important concept to understand the definition of, because there is a lot of misunderstanding about exactly what the quintessence is. And this is partly because the magical tradition has appropriated the term quintessence and used it in a way which is misleading. So first of all, let's understand that the quintessence is the 5th element. In alchemical lore, L-O-R-E, alchemical lore, the act of creation involves the extraction of 4 elemental conditions out of the original or primary chaos, and these are known as the 4 elements. Technically and more accurately, so that we know exactly what we're talking about, these are known as the 4 alchemical elements, and they each represent a state or condition that is required at the very root of every living system in order for that system to exist, for it to be structured properly, and for it to function properly. So the quintessence is represented, generally speaking, by this symbol. And the quintessence, the actual word quintessence itself, is from the Latin quint or quinta, which means 5 or fifth. And so the quintessence is a 5th element over and above the original 4 elements which were extracted out of the original chaos. While the quintessence is a 5th element, it is not any of the previous 4 elements, but it is a combination of those 4 elements into a new single state. And therefore it's referred to as a 5th element, or the 5th element. So the quintessence or 5th element is the other 4 conditions harmonized, integrated, or as we say in alchemy, cohobated into a new condition, which is a 5th condition that didn't exist before, and therefore alchemists refer to it as the quintessence. The most important concept to be aware of about the quintessence is that it pre-exists the 4 elements, and then through the alchemical process, through the alchemical archetypal alchemical operation, which we refer to as the spagyric process, the 5th element is recreated but in physical existence. And the important thing about the quintessence is that it is very similar to what they refer to in the Eastern tradition as Akasha, the Akasha element. And anybody who has studied Eastern mysticism will be aware that there's a concept related to the Akasha element known as the Akashic records. In other words, that the 5th element is the place where all the records concerning any living system are stored and preserved. So for example, while you're alive, everything that you think, everything that you feel, everything that you experience, everything that you do is recorded by your personal unconscious. Just like a video camera and a microphone recording every activity you're ever involved in your life, but at the same time your thoughts and emotions and all the chemical processes inside of your body, all the psychological processes going on inside of your mind are all recorded in your personal unconscious. And this is the modern term for what the Eastern tradition called Akasha, and what the Western alchemical tradition referred to as the unconscious mind. But they had a very specific technical term in alchemy, in Western alchemy, for the unconscious mind, which is the anima mundi, or the spirit of the world, or a world. In other words, a living system. It is the unconscious hard drive or recording mechanism of a living system. So your quintessence state, your personal anima mundi, your personal unconscious mind records everything about your life and what you are. And this recorded condition is the blueprint for everything that you are. It also contains all the rules and laws which are required to structure you and to keep you functioning properly while you're in a life, while you are a living system. So it is like the operating system of your existence, but it is much more complex than like a computer operating system, but it plays the same role. When you're born, your parents conceive you in the womb of your mother, and the very first cell that becomes fertilized starts to divide and multiply. The rules and laws which govern that cell division, what those cells will be like and what they will develop into, the rules and laws which govern all that are contained in your personal unconscious and also in the collective unconscious, because part of you is a collective entity. You are part of the human species, and therefore all of those things which are generally human about you are programmed into your development in the womb from the collective unconscious. But all of those things which are specific to you as an individual incarnating entity are programmed into your development from your personal unconscious. All of this information and these rules that govern your structure and function and your development are what I refer to as the blueprint of you as a living system. This is your quintessence, and your quintessence contains all of the previous information about what you have experienced in lives, and your quintessence contains all of the rules which govern how you unfold and develop in your life, right from that very first fertilized cell right up to the moment when you die and disincarnate. In alchemy, the Philosopher's Stone itself, the transmutation agent, is a quintessence, what I refer to as a Q-state substance, in that it contains in a very pure form all of the rules and laws for the substance that that stone, that transmutation agent, was produced from. Because your unconscious mind, at its very depth, at the highest part of it, at the apex of your mental pyramid, because your unconscious mind is your quintessence and contains all that information about you, it governs over everything that you are. Every cell death and cell division inside your organic being, every thought you have, every motivation you have, every situation you get yourself into, all the things which come into your life and all the things which are removed from your life, everything about your life as a living system is governed by that blueprint, by that Q-state quintessence, by the deepest level of your personal unconscious mind. Now, if we take that blueprint and we personify it, to use a computer analogy, if we take that container, which is your blueprint, which has all the rules and laws and all your memories and experiences contained in it, if we take that and personify it, in other words, if we give it an avatar, if we allow that information to present itself to us in an anthropomorphic form, that anthropomorphic form is traditionally referred to in modern Hermetism as either the holy guardian angel or the higher genius or the Yakida, the unity consciousness, the place that contains everything. And because it contains everything and is holistic, it is unified, harmonious, and completely in balance. So if we can imagine our mind as being like a computer system, and we want to access our blueprint storage folder, the process of accessing that blueprint storage folder is what modern Hermetism refers to, generally speaking, as knowledge of and conversation with the higher genius. In other words, we have entered into a state where we now have knowledge of what is contained in that blueprint storage place, and we can actually communicate with that knowledge and information and learn about that storage place itself, as well as the information which is contained in it. Into my workshop because across the road one of the neighbours has decided to hire a couple of guys to do his gardening, and they're busily using weed cutters down there at the moment, which are making a hell of a racket, so you might hear them in the background a bit. Okay, so where were we? Accessing the blueprint of who you are and what you are is referred to traditionally in modern Hermetism, and by modern I mean from about the beginning of the 1800s, although references to this concept go way back thousands of years. But in modern Hermetism we refer to accessing that blueprint state, the higher genius, the quintessence, the anima mundi, the memory of a living system. We refer to it as knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. Now, superior mainstream esoteric training, and remember here I'm saying mainstream, and by superior I mean the best of those mainstream systems or schools, either openly teach or in a manner vaguely preserve the concept that the summit of their training systems is the ability to get access to, communicate with, and have knowledge of that blueprint state. And different superior mainstream systems discuss that concept in different ways, but they all are basically referring to the same thing, that at the end of all serious esoteric training, at the end of all what I refer to as authentic Hermetic initiation, is the ability to effectively and accurately access that blueprint state to attain knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. Now, why do we want to do that? Why do all these schools and systems point in that direction, either vaguely or insinuating that that's what the goal is, or openly stating it, as they do in the Golden Dawn system? Why do we want that goal? Why is that the summit of the general progress, the general development in Hermetic training systems? And the answer to that is simple. In that Q state, because everything that you are, everything that you have been, all knowledge about you as an evolving soul, all of the rules and laws that govern your existence, that govern you as a living system, are contained in that blueprint state, in that Q state. And because of this, it should be logical that if you could access that state and read it accurately, and actually also directly learn from it, then you have access to the authoritative source of information about what you are and what you should be doing in your life in order to be most productive par excellence. In other words, there is no better authority, no more productive place to be accessing information about who you are, and what you should be doing than to get access to your anima mundi, your higher genius, your quintessence or Q state. This concept goes way, way back in history to the very beginning of the Hermetic tradition as we understand it, historically speaking, which is ancient Egypt, where originally the ability to gain this kind of access to the higher genius was very much concealed from the average individual in Egyptian society. And this process, this ability to accurately and effectively access that state, because this is important, it's not just about waltzing into that state willy-nilly and taking all kinds of things for granted and assuming all kinds of things. It's a very technical process and a very technical situation to access that state effectively and accurately. The ability to do that was only granted to the high priests of Egypt and to the royal family, who at that time were considered the only individuals in Egyptian society who were spiritually mature enough to deal with that kind of training and to deal with the outcome of that kind of training. In other words, to be able to handle what they found out about once they gained access to the quintessence state, to the higher genius. So at the very beginning of Egyptian history, that knowledge and information about how to gain access to that state and what that state was kept concealed, deeply concealed. And to pass that knowledge on to anybody outside of the closed elite brotherhood who designed and preserved these techniques and practiced them was a death sentence. That's how important it was to the ancient Egyptians to keep this information concealed. And the way they described this process and this potential goal was they talked about it as becoming one with Osiris. Osiris being the archetype of the higher genius in humanity. So the stories and the so-called myths and legends about Osiris are actually metaphors for the development and life pattern of the higher genius itself, not only in the individual human being but in humanity. So when the Pharaoh talked about becoming one with Osiris, this is the same in modern Hermetism as saying knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. So this process is at the very core, at the very heart of the Hermetic tradition, and it has continued to be the most important part of Hermetic training since the very beginning of Hermetism right up until the present day. While this process was more carefully defined by the ancient Egyptians, today most schools talk about it very vaguely, or they only insinuate concepts about it because they don't really understand the process effectively enough to sit down and have an honest, detailed and productive conversation about it. So they only hint at it in the hope that their students won't ask too much about what all this access to the higher genius state is. And we see this especially in modern mystical schools of Western occultism, where they are extremely poetic and vague about this entire subject. And then on the other end of the scale, we get systems like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which are very blunt about what knowledge and conversation with the higher genius is. And all through their grade degree rituals, up into the level of 5 equals 6, which is Adeptus Minor, they trace the path or the story or the legend or the mythology of the candidate travelling the journey towards knowledge and conversation with the higher genius, and they discuss every aspect of that journey in detail. Although, of course, the language that they describe all of this information in the Golden Dawn grade rituals is couched in very technical Hermetic terminology and poetic language. But they're very blunt about it. They make it very clear that the summit and goal of the Golden Dawn system is to eventually gain knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. So the next thing we need to understand about this entire process is we know now that the whole mythology surrounding the Necha Osiris in the ancient Egyptian esoteric system is related to knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. It's not too hard, if we understand that, then to trace down through history how this concept was expressed in other cultures, such as in the Greek culture, the Greek mystery religions, the Roman mystery religions, how this concept became slightly twisted and perverted by them, and how it lost its power under those two particular cultures, and how it passed into Christianity, and the whole idea of the Christos, which is the same concept as the higher genius. The entire humanity, collective humanity, has a Christ condition at its core, and so does each individual human. So Christ and the apostles were only reiterating what the Egyptians had previously presented in their mystery teachings for the Pharaoh and the high priests. But the Christians were the first cult or sect to start taking that information, which once was only for the elite, and then start presenting it in a format that was designed to be digested by common humanity. So the big difference between Christianity and the ancient Egyptian mystery religion is that Christianity was an attempt to take something which at one time in human evolution was considered to be only useful for for a very few very evolved individuals in Egyptian society, and now basically say this entire system, all this knowledge and the science of soul development, Hermetism, it's now a time for it to be presented and accessible to common humanity, or let's say humanity on a broader scale than it had been before. If nothing else, this was the motive behind Christ's original ministry, if we might call it that. Then we have the Christian era, the Dark Ages, medieval Europe and the Renaissance, and the development of that entire Christian concept about Hermetic initiation, in the development of it in Western culture. And this entire system developed in Western culture largely through the Catholic monastic system. And these were the guys who kept possession of the real understanding of both mystic Christianity and the occult tradition, the Hermetic tradition, inside of Catholic Christianity, and crossed that boundary between Christianity and the occult tradition. Because we know that the early monastic fraternities were the place where Hermetism was originally preserved in the Western tradition, and that Hermetic monks and their non-cleric brothers were the people who passed this information on to individuals who were lay Christians or outside of the Christian church in the Western tradition. Then in modern times, when this whole system of Hermetic initiation and its goal of knowledge of and conversation with the higher genius starts to emerge into Renaissance Europe and then into the modern Hermetic tradition in Western culture. By the time we see these ideas coalesce in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which might be seen as being the high point of the attempt at gathering together what was previously known about Hermetic initiation in Western culture and piecing it all together into an operating system which would behave like a story about not only the history of occultism in Western tradition and the knowledge about how the higher genius was accessed. The Golden Dawn could be seen as the pinnacle so far in the development of that knowledge in the Western tradition in modern times. There is one core document that served as the primary inspiration for the adepts of the Golden Dawn and then the adepts of offshoots of the original Golden Dawn, such as the Servants of Light and the Inner Light and Builders of the Aditum and the OTO and other organisations like that, which were all basically like offshoots or schisms of the original Golden Dawn. There is one single document that the advanced adepts of those groups looked at as the let's say the Bible of information about how an individual was to achieve knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. And that document is a book known as the Sacred Magic of Abramilian the Mage. Okay, so I'm not going to go into detail about that document because there is a ton of documented evidence online that you can research yourself. There are a number of books that have been written on the subject. There are a number of journal style books which have been written by people who have attempted the process which is discussed in the original text of the Sacred Magic of Abramilian the Mage. All I'm going to do here is basically explain what the book is about. So, long story short, Abramilian or Abramalian, depending on which way you want to spell it, was a magician, a Hebrew Kabbalist who was deeply steeped in the study of what we call high magic in the Western tradition. He wrote a book which was basically a manual for his son, and this manual was a description of how a person could access their higher genius effectively. And notice I don't add on to that accurately. The book ends with the practitioner making their first access to their higher genius, but then doesn't explain what to do once you make that access. So Abramilian starts off talking about the history of this concept of knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. He talks about falsehoods concerning it. He talks about things which are accurate concerning it. And then he goes into talking about a very lengthy magical rite which takes months and months to perform, which culminates in the end in the manifestation of the higher genius and the magician's ability to have knowledge of and conversation with that entity, with the avatar of his own blueprint, which in that book, in the Sacred Magic, he refers to as the Holy Guardian Angel, which is really a technical inaccuracy because angels do not take position as the superior summit of human existence. Human beings are an entire different species from the angelic hierarchy, and so at our summit, at the capstone of the pyramid of our psychology and our existence and what we are, is not an angel. It is the higher genius, as the Greeks referred to it. So Abramilian's technology was not really accurate in that way. But anyway, he lays out a very complicated, very difficult, very lengthy process of meditations and various practices which culminate, I think, at the end of a year in the higher genius physically manifesting as in the manner of Solomonic evocation. And then the magician has the ability to have conversation with and knowledge of his higher genius. So this book was first publicized by one of the men who originally created the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn system, and that man is probably the most famous individual connected with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and that is MacGregor Mathers, who was an advanced Freemason. He wanted to create a magical fraternity that would also allow women to be involved, because of course Freemasonry, traditional and regular Freemasonry, lawful Freemasonry, doesn't allow women to join. And he knew that Freemasonry had originally been an esoteric organisation, but that it had devolved heavily since the mid-1600s, And so he wanted to basically give access to accurate and authoritative Hermetism to Western culture again. So he and a small number of other individuals, through a whole lot of shenanigans, put together a fraternal system which had basically 6 levels back at the original conception of the Hermetic Order of Golden Dawn. They took information from various sources, slapped it all together, filled in the gaps with more detailed explanation, and overlaid the whole system with a technique of magical action which should have made the rituals in the grade system of that order actually psychologically affect the candidate and push him towards knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. Well, MacGregor Mathers, who created that entire system, also found an old manuscript in the what I think is referred to as the Arsenal Library in France, written by Abramelin, called The Sacred Magic of Abramelin, and he published it. And then I think, I'm not quite sure, but I think Aleister Crowley published a version of it, and then later on it was discovered that MacGregor Mathers' version was not complete, and there were some later publications of complete versions of the manuscript of the Sacred Magic. So, complicated subject from an academic point of view about that manuscript and MacGregor Mathers and Aleister Crowley's and later editions of it that were published. The important idea to understand is that the adepts, the advanced adepts in the Golden Dawn, immediately saw that original text and Mathers' publication of it, and then eventually Crowley's publication, and then eventually the more modern publications, as being their Bible. One of the problems with the Golden Dawn, and then of course with its offshoots, BOTA, also other groups like Amorc, the Inner Light, Servants of the Light, is that they weren't very explicit about how to get access to the higher genius. But this book actually gave a recipe for getting access, allegedly. Ideally, it gave a recipe for getting access. So as initiates of these different modern Hermetic schools were climbing up through the grades, learning all their knowledge, going through all these rituals, applying all these various esoteric practices to themselves, finally when they get to the inner order level, the adept level of these schools, and start getting access to more private and more rarefied levels of instruction, they start to realize that this school actually doesn't have an absolutely reliable, accurate and effective technique for getting access to the very thing which they preach is the goal and summit of their system. So a bit of a stupid situation here. Hey, Hermetism is all about knowledge and conversation. Then we're going to put you through years and years of complicated study and practice, and then at some point you're suddenly going to realize that none of this is actually effective in getting knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. So what that has led to is the adepts in these schools, the advanced adepts, the people who have got to the point of realizing, okay, I've done all this study, so where is the recipe? Where's the technique? Where's the teacher? Where are the dudes who have done this and can tell me how to achieve it themselves? It doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. But the closest thing that came to it is the sacred magic of Abramelin the Mage. So if you really want to know about the Yakida, if you really want to know about the higher genius, if you want to understand what it means to contact that state within yourself, and if you want to understand the condition in modern occultism around attempts at attaining that state. First of all, study the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, what it is, what it's about. Read a book by Israel Regardie called What You Should Know About the Golden Dawn. If you want to then get deeper, buy a copy of a book by Israel Regardie which is called The Golden Dawn Encyclopedia of Magic. I don't know how they sell it now, but the popular edition of that book used to be a paperback. It was very big and heavy, and it was euphemistically referred to as the black brick. But it has all of the teachings, all of the rituals, all of the knowledge and instruction that was generally taught to students in the Golden Dawn in the early days, in the first generation of Golden Dawn students and adepts. After studying all that stuff, you'll get a good idea of what knowledge and conversation is about and the condition that these schools are in today relative to being able to allegedly provide access to knowledge and conversation. Then you'll get an idea of why the sacred magic of Abram Milne the Mage was so important. Also very helpful to read that book, but don't go straight to it first. At least study the Golden Dawn system first so that you have a proper context for understanding the sacred magic and why it was important to these guys. Then the final thing to understand about the sacred magic was that generally it doesn't work. There are documented expositions from individuals who say they have succeeded in this work, but there is no follow-up material as far as I know. Once an individual understands the actual technical concepts that surround knowledge and conversation, it becomes quickly obvious from all the documented information about the sacred magic that while some individuals may have made a one-off or few small successful attempts at knowledge and conversation with the higher genius, that it seems that there is no successful follow-up to that. Once they gain access to that state, they then don't know what to do with it because there is no education in the modern Western Hermetic tradition at mainstream level, not in the underground stream level, which then tells you what to do once you get knowledge and conversation, because that is a whole other story. So here's the kind of final word on the Yakida, where this last podcast about the Partsufim individually is concerned. Number one, the Yakida is also known as the higher genius, less accurately as the holy guardian angel. In the alchemical tradition, it is known as the quintessence and the anima mundi. That this state is like a database, a storehouse of data that contains everything about your soul's existence from the first point that it was created. And that database has recorded accurately everything about your existence. It also contains the instructions or laws and rules which allow you to exist as a living system and allow you to pass in and out of incarnation and to live a life in incarnation. Therefore, this database of information, the Yakida, is the single authoritative source about what you are, who you are, and what you should be doing most productively. What you should be doing to be most productive and economic about your existence. The second idea that I wanted to put forward in this video is that accessing that database of information is known as knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. This is what the exact term that I use. So, and you'll hear this in future podcasts repeated over and over. Knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. When we go internally in a magical or in alchemical esoteric practices, and we finally access the higher genius, that database is like a living artificial intelligence and has an avatar which is an anthropomorphic representation of everything it contains. In other words, that avatar is a way of communicating artificially with the blueprint or database. And that avatar behaves like it is an intelligent being in its own right. So to access that database, to read it and to communicate with it is like accessing a living being that has its own existence in its own right. The best way I think of describing that metaphorically using computer language is that when you think you see the avatar, when you think you see and are talking to your higher genius in a state, you are actually talking to a personification, an anthropomorphic avatar of that database. The third concept I wanted to present was that knowledge and conversation with the higher genius has always been considered the summit of the general Hermetic training tradition. When a person talks about entering into Hermetic training, when a person talks about receiving Hermetic initiation, when a person enters into an expert, accurate, and effective Hermetic initiation with an expert teacher, all of these processes, concepts, and ideas culminate in the summit of knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. That is not the end of the Hermetic journey, it is the summit of the initiatory process. Initiation ends in knowledge and conversation with successful, effective, accurate knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. Once you attain that state, a whole new level of activity begins, as long as what you have done is successful up to that point. So initiation ends with knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. Once you get access to the higher genius, can know it and communicate with it, that is the beginning of what I refer to as spiritual illumination, or the vision of Hermes. The vision of Hermes is the vision that the higher genius has of you as a living system and your reality. When you get access to the higher genius, you get access to all knowledge about how you exist, why you exist, the rules that govern you, and everything that you've done in the past, and where you're headed in the future. That state, having access to that kind of information accurately, is what we refer to in the Western tradition as illumination. And of course it takes time to get into a good relationship with the higher genius, to be able to understand what it's saying to you and what you are learning from it. So illumination is a progressive process. It is graded. You step up through it in levels until you eventually hit a state of full illumination sometime way, 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 way in the future. Full illumination basically means you have completely immersed yourself in that blueprint and you know everything about it, everything it stands for, everything it's recorded, all the rules that are contained in it that govern you, and you effectively can communicate with it and gain any kind of knowledge about it from it that it can offer you. That is full illumination. So the end of initiation is the beginning of gaining illumination, the steps up the ladder towards full illumination. Advanced adepts are the people who are in that state. They are slowly ascending the mount of initiation toward the summit where full illumination can be accessed. This is what Hermetism is all about. Gaining access to knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. So in future podcasts, I'm going to refer back to this concept a lot. It's important to understand everything I have said in this podcast in order to understand the key premises upon which all the rest of Hermetism is based. The practice of magic, the study of magic, the practice and study of alchemy, historic Hermetism, the famous individuals who have made up the brotherhood of the Hermetic tradition over the last 6,000 years or more. In order to understand all that stuff, it all comes back to understanding that they were trying to get access to that blueprint, and they were trying to do it with systems that made sure that access was accurate and effective, because they wanted illumination. They wanted to know what the best thing was for them to be doing in their life in order to be most productive from a spiritual point of view. And that is what we call attaining a state of illumination, which is where, of course, the concept Illuminati originated from and then was later perverted and has now become a ridiculous part of modern conspiracy theory. Okay, so it's probably a relatively brief podcast. I can't tell yet how much time it took to record this much. There's not an enormous amount to say about the higher genius, but I'm going to elaborate on particular aspects of it in future podcast series as I start to talk about alchemy and how the alchemists saw the quintessence and what they did about it in order to get access to that state. I'm going to talk about the actual process of initiation itself, what training is about, where students come from, what makes a teacher, what makes a good student, how to get access to that kind of specialized training, what it's been like down through history, what it is like in modern times, what it is like presently today, and the forces and environments that are affecting modern Hermetism that need to be seriously discussed and understood. So I'm going to elaborate on everything I've said in this podcast over and over again, little bits here and there that are like breadcrumbs that you need to realize what it is I'm talking about, pluck those ideas out and piece them all together into a single body of knowledge yourself. I'm not just going to dump the whole story right in your lap in one podcast. It's a complex thing to understand, and a lot of information about initiation, about knowledge and conversation, and about illumination need to be repeated over and over and need to be kind of spread out in a broad discussion. So thanks again for watching this podcast, if you got to this point, I hope that kind of rounds things up a little bit as far as what it is that we're considering here, and for people who are relatively new to the study of Hermetism, what the whole point in the end is. It's an important thing to understand. A lot of people get involved in the study of Hermetism and in practice of Hermetism and get involved in schools that have Hermetic training without actually understanding at all, even for years and years and years, where is all of this heading? Well, this podcast explains that. One more podcast to come on the subject of the Partsufim. I'm going to wrap it up. The previous podcasts have all discussed the subject from the point of view of each individual Partsufi. Now, in the last podcast, which I think is podcast number 18, I'm just going to do an overview. This is why you should be bothering to study the subject of Partsufim theory, and some advice about where you can get some practical access, and also some reading material which will help you evolve your understanding about Partsufim theory. Why it's important. One of the reasons why I'm talking about the whole Partsufim theory thing is because virtually no other Kabbalistic systems, or systems that use Kabbalah as part of their teaching, will tell you very much at all about the Partsufim. They'll mention it sometimes, they'll talk about what the Partsufim are, but it is extremely difficult to get reliable information on why it is necessary to study them, what role they play in Hermetic training, and why they were so important in the Kabbalistic scheme. Those kind of things, very hard to find information on. So I'm going to wrap all that up in the final Partsufim podcast, which will be the next one. And then we'll be into the second series, which is going to be my discussion of the concept of creation from an Hermetic alchemical point of view. This is another thing which is extremely important to understand, and which virtually no mainstream schools discuss anything about at all. All the years that I've been involved in different esoteric systems, I don't think I've ever come across one school that says more than a few sentences in all of its years of instructions about one of the most important subject areas in historic Hermetism, and that is how Hermetic adepts viewed the process of creation. It's important to know about this knowledge because all of the other ideas that are key to Hermetic worldview, the alchemic principles, the alchemic elements, the planets, astrology, divination, all of these things, the rationale behind all of these things is rooted in how the Hermetic adepts believed that creation unfolded itself and what was responsible. So we're going to discuss that in the next podcast, which is going to be the last in this series, and I am going to use in the next series I'm going to use a textbook which you can follow along with yourself, and is easy to get online at Adam McLean's alchemy website.com, I think it is, called The Golden Chain of Homer, or the Aurea Catena.